All right, welcome back to the Canadian Gun Vault. This week's episode and podcast, Behind the Vault Door, is going to include one of the more frequently asked questions that seems to come across my display screen more and more often every day. What should I buy for my first gun? I'm seeing it all the time, and I don't mind answering it. I love when people send in questions on the Instagram page, the YouTube channel, certainly at the Canadian Gun Vault Inc. at gmail.com. I get asked this question a lot, and the truth is that there's no fixed answer. For people that are just getting into this great activity, you're definitely going to have to ask yourself some serious questions and answer honestly, of course, as to what it is that you're going to be doing with the firearm that you choose. And so, I mean, there's so many different choices out there. I mean, the firearm community, anybody that spent any amount of time in the firearm community will probably tell you that there's just endless number of choices out there. Certainly, if you're a brand new shooter, brand new to the activity, and you really don't have a great deal of exposure to firearms, and or if, perhaps you're a little more recoil shy than, some others, you definitely want to start with something smaller. Don't run out and get yourself a 460 because you heard it's the most powerful handgun in the world, or a 500. I wouldn't recommend that. That'd be my first best advice to you. Secondly, definitely get your RPAL. When we talk about first gun, we're talking about rifles and handguns. I would strongly recommend that everybody out there getting their license just take that one small step further and get their restricted license as well. And definitely allow yourself the flexibility to own a broader range of firearms. The idea that you would limit yourself to just long guns is kind of ridiculous. Why limit yourself in that way? And in that fashion, I would suggest that people get out there and get into the gun stores, try a couple on. It's no different than perhaps going into your favorite clothing store and putting on a pair of pants. I mean, some things just don't fit. If you want to own a certain particular kind of firearm, it's best to know in advance whether or not it's too big for you. Fit is important, and certainly in the firearms industry, with the number of choices that are available to people, the opportunity to hold firearms in your hand and or to place it against your shoulder to determine whether or not any specific gun might be right for you is a great place to start. If it doesn't feel good in your hand, chances are you're not going to want to shoot it, and you're not going to want to enjoy it, or you won't enjoy it the same way you might something that perhaps fits you better. So starting from the beginning, a lot of people start with 22s, and of course great firearms like the Ruger Mark III and now the Mark IV make a terrific natural first selection for a lot of people. To work on the fundamentals, like sight picture, grip, trigger control, good form, and to acquire the necessary skill set to become an accurate shooter, to become a proficient shooter. It's good to start with something that doesn't have a ridiculously large muzzle report and or cost. I mean, 22 ammo has certainly risen in price here in Canada and definitely in the U.S. But 22 is still pretty readily available, especially up here in Canada. We have lots of it, and it's a lot cheaper to shoot than perhaps 9 and 45. And so as a starter piece, there's nothing wrong with a 22 pistol, and truthfully, even as a seasoned shooter, there's a lot of merit in owning something like that, and spending time at the range developing the necessary skill set. I mean, because it is a process, whereby you acquire the necessary skills to move up. And I really would fault people for placing a gun that's too large or too powerful, perhaps, in a novice's hands. And, it's great to expose them to, that kind of, power, like to give them something, that's perhaps of a magnum size and to expose them to some of the excitement that comes along with shooting cartridges like that. But it's not necessarily the correct first move. So if you think about, running out and getting yourself that big gun, I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend definitely starting, with a 22. Which is not uncommon for people to begin there. If you're one of those people though that picks up on things quick, and you're not one of those people that shies away from a little extra excitement, perhaps a 9 is a good place to start. And, if you've gone to the range and, if you've rented guns, with the supervised rentals that are available out there, at places like Urban Tactical, where you can try different types of firearms and enjoy, the benefits connected to shooting a gun before you actually go out and buy one, which, like a car, it's important that you test drive certain things, and you do have that option available to you in places like that. I would definitely suggest, though, that if you're one of those people that really, gravitates towards, exciting activities, and you probably will grow very tired of a 22 pretty quickly, and it might be relegated to the status of, Safe Queen in quick order, and or traded in for something different. But it's always a good thing to have when you bring people out shooting for the first time, to have a 22 on hand to kind of give them the rundown on how a firearm works, and to show them the operational controls. To have that in your repertoire of firearms is always a good thing. So if you can, monetarily get away with purchasing one, even if you don't use it much after your first, perhaps year of engaging the activity, I would suggest that, starting with the 22 is great. If you're only planning on owning, a couple of firearms, which everybody does in the beginning, but nobody ever seems to follow through on. Everybody seems to get more firearms than they plan on getting. Definitely start with a smaller caliber. And certainly you got to think about things like cost. I mean, there's no point in buying a firearm if you can't afford to run it. A lot of people don't realize how much more expensive, things like 45 are than 9. And so if you wanted to begin, with a 9, or if you've been exposed to firearms and you've gotten pretty accustomed and familiar with things like 22, and you're ready to step up, and that's where perhaps the bulk of this conversation will revolve, I would suggest that, you start looking at things like, what are you going to do it for? Like what exactly you're planning on doing with the firearm. The idea that, different firearms are suited better for certain purposes is the kind of thing that you got to consider. Are you planning on competing with it? Are you planning on just becoming proficient with it? Are you going to target shoot with it? Are you going to be a collector? These are all the things that you really want answered. Do you just want to own a gun? Which is something that some people do. Now more and more every day, I'm seeing people that just, they just want to own one. They want to go out and get a license, and they want to have the ability to go out when they want to. Perhaps they've been out with a friend a few times, and they realize that they really enjoy the activity. There's, therapeutic value connected to it. I'm thinking that, there's a great place to start in the CZ series of firearms. And I say that for a lot of reasons. They certainly offer a lot of flexibility that some others do not. CZs are a very reliable gun. A lot of people believe that guns, always go bang when you pull the trigger. That's not necessarily true. They've done a great job in this industry of weeding out the less reliable firearms that were once available. And now pretty much most firearms are pretty reliable. Compared to decades past. But I mean, if you start with the CZs, the CZs have been around for a long time. And certainly I remember in the 90s, the 75B, and it's evolved into, a competition platform now that you see very often in the Canadian firearm community. And certainly the grips on that gun, and the frame of the frame is like not quite as wide as some other models, so it's more well suited to a broader range of hand sizes, which brings us back to getting the correct fit. They're rock solid, reliable, they're very accurate. CZ series of firearms are just a natural choice if you've got $700 or $800 burning a hole in your pocket and you want to buy something that's really cool and good. The CZ's a great firearm to start with. I can tell you that there are other firearms that are fantastic as well, that may not have the same kind of quality and or perhaps refinement in terms of things like the trigger and design. Older firearms like Berettas, the 92 FS series is a great firearm, but again, the grip's pretty wide. The frame is substantially larger, in my opinion, than the CZ series, and they're both 9s, but completely different experiences in terms of feel in your hand and trigger pull weights and the way they perform. One definitely is a combat platform in that Beretta, where the CZ, as I said earlier, can perform a more broader range of activities: target shooting, competition. To purchase a CZ is a great idea. I think it's a great all-round performer. Not that there's anything wrong with the Beretta. In fact, I'm an enormous fan of the 92 series of pistols. But definitely you've got to look at things like, what it is that you're planning on doing with it. If you're planning on engaging in a broader range of activities, the CZs make a terrific selection. If you want to get into more dedicated platforms and spend more money, there are things out there. The other idea that you would have to consider, is do you mind whether it has 7 rounds or 10 rounds in it? I mean, to move to a 1911 style platform is great for a lot of people, especially the ones with smaller hands. It's a very slim frame, and certainly the 1911 design has been around for over 100 years and is a huge favorite amongst people in the firearm community, especially in the United States. They love their 1911s. To our American listeners, I'm a big fan too. In fact, I love the design so much. One of my favorite variations, the LAR Grizzly, which is a supersized version of that gun, and certainly not for beginners. I could tell you that there's so many different versions of the 1911 that are out there, and that LAR is definitely one of my personal favorites. But when you look at guns like the SIGs that are out there, the Smith & Wessons that are out there, I mean, there's a lot of different versions of that 1911 platform, if that's to your liking, because aesthetically it's a very pleasing pistol to look at. And on that note, I would start to talk about the polymer pistols, which a lot of people don't care for in terms of their aesthetic. But in terms of sheer ruggedness, corrosion resistance, durability, it's pretty tough to beat the polymer series of pistols. And I mean, we wouldn't be right if we didn't speak about the right out of the gate, the Glock. I mean, I carried a Glock certainly for many years as a police officer. I get asked a lot of questions about the Glock. The Glock is one of those guns that, a lot of people either love it or you hate it for its looks, for its trigger feel. It has that single action, double action, Glock trigger that some people just really take to right away. And if you don't know anything else, actually, you get used to it pretty quick. But the Glocks, I get that question quite a bit. What do you think about Glocks? And my response always is I was forced to carry one for years. Do they work? Absolutely. Do they go bang every time you pull the trigger? I have yet to see a Glock fail outside of policing. And when I say that, I'm talking about a unit that was subject to 100,000 rounds plus finally failed. And to have a gun that is capable of achieving those kinds of round counts without any kind of failure is phenomenal, or cleaning for that matter. I know that a lot of police services insist on their firearms being cleaned, at least once a year. To have a Glock, is to have a reliable tool. And that's why it's so popular with policing. I mean, it's simple. It's got no external safeties. It's definitely an item that can be subject to a lot of abuse, as most polymer pistols are. Some are a little more fragile than others. But a Glock always works. And that's something that it's a bit of a huge debate, actually, now that I think about it, in the firearms community. 1911 versus Glock seems to be the very popular, if you want to call it that, debate in the United States. Certainly the 1911 has seen 2 World War conflicts and has a reputation for reliability and quality connected to it, and there's so many different versions of that gun out there. But Glocks and polymer guns have a degree of enjoyability. Like you grab onto a Glock and it's got this feel to it It's plastic. I mean, let's face facts. It's not metal, and some people want to feel that in their hands when they hold a gun. They want to know that they're holding a chunk, if you want to call it that, and that's certainly what we used to call it in the policing community. Like they're never going to achieve. Polymer guns are never going to achieve that metal feel in your hand. That sense of holding a firearm. That would meet a traditional, standard. Are they lighter? Yes. Do they balance as well? Most times not. And that's probably where, for me anyway, the debate ends, is when I'm holding a steel frame gun, like a 1911 or a Beretta or a Browning high power. It has a balance that polymer guns seem to have a very difficult time achieving. And, certainly there are some fantastic polymer guns out there. The Glock, for its aesthetic, it's pretty boxy. And, I mean, if you're purchasing a gun and it means anything to you, how your gun looks. I mean, if you want to pick a cool-looking gun, the Glock might not be it. If you want to, get a competition gun that is always going to run, and or if you're in the United States and you place a lot of emphasis on things like self-defense, it's pretty tough to beat a Glock with the way they perform and in terms of their reliability. And so, I mean, you could do things to improve the triggers. Those options are available to you. But ultimately, I would steer away from the Glock and would get into something more like perhaps Walther's PPQ. And I have a number of friends that shoot these guns, and they swear by them. They love them. The Walther PPQ is probably one of the most fantastically refined polymer-based guns that I've come across. They've got these fantastic triggers and clearly an example of German engineering and the kind of product that Walther has been pumping out for quite some time. You look at guns like that, but I mean they're going to be a little more expensive, and instead of spending $700 or $800, you might be into a bit of a G note there. And I mean, if it makes any difference to you, you spend a little time in a firearms store and hold them in your hand, you might find that the PPQ is a much more comfortable feeling gun. And as are some of the other more expensive German options like HK. There are options available to you if you want to own a polymer gun and not spend quite as much money. Steyr is one of those terrifically underrated guns that we see sometimes on the firing line. I certainly see them in the exchanges going for about $500. They're a lot less, certainly when they're used, and there are people that kind of shift off them very quickly, the same way people do Glocks. I find that a lot of people get out of the line, and they were told they should buy a Glock for their first gun. A lot of police officers, when they decide to get their private civilian firearm licenses, decide to purchase Glocks in an effort to have the option of training on their own time with the sidearm that they would be carrying while employed. Purchase Glocks, and I think that's a bit of a mistake too. I mean, if all the controls are in the same place, and I mean, you get used to changing magazines and operating those controls, it really doesn't matter whether or not it's Glock or something else. And I mean, if you're going to be using that firearm in your own time, you might as well be comfortable with it and like the way it looks and or ultimately like the price tag connected to it. But there are options other than the Glock, and so you look at guns like the Walthers, and they're slightly more expensive options than the HKs. But if you wanted to get into a gun that would be very reasonable and a good performing gun, I would not tell people to shy away from the Steyr. And I find what a lot of people do is they get into polymer guns, and between the balance and the trigger pulls on some of these type units, they get discouraged when they buy their first gun and they're not hitting their target at 15 yards or 20 yards or 25 yards. So to spend a little more time, to invest the time in proper training and learning the necessary techniques to improve your scores at the target range, and during training. Don't give up so fast, on a gun like the Steyr. I definitely think that the Steyr 9mm is one you would want to look at, and it's one that I've recommended to people often if they want to get into something that's not quite as expensive. And certainly it's the type of thing that, not everybody would agree upon, but I actually like the Steyr a lot. So I would tell you to take a look at that. I would steer away, and not to take anything away from it. It's not that I don't like the Jericho pistol, but they do make a polymer Jericho pistol with a polymer frame. But I just don't find it balances quite as well as the steel version. Although the Jericho is a fantastic unit. Again, another one of those underrated units that can be purchased, for $600 or less, and usually comes with like several magazines and a carrying case and lots of accessories. The Jericho is not a bad little piece, and actually it's not that little. It's quite a heavy piece, and there's a reason for that. That gun was designed to fire a cartridge more powerful than .40, and yet you can purchase it in 9, and it's quite controllable in that cartridge. I've seen a lot of people on the line with them, and they make it their first gun and they enjoy it. And for the people that, like I said, don't know anything else, it's a great gun and a solid piece made by these Israeli people. And so, something to look at. So if you're looking for a firearm and you have a kind of fixed price range in your mind, you have lots of choices, but ultimately it will come down to the way it fits in your hand, and exactly how much money you have to spend, and what you enjoy doing with it. So that's going to be my bit, and certainly my opinion on the subject of purchasing a new handgun. But if we get into things like pistols for the purpose of collection, and I've had a lot of people that have approached me because the page has on our Instagram page is so vintage, firearm heavy. I've had a lot of people ask me what my choice would be, my first choice for a collectible, and I surprise a lot of people when I say this, and I don't blame people for getting a little bit excited about this one when I say it, but I'm going to tell you right now that you got to take a look at the Tokarovs. The Tokarov pistol, and I've talked about this on the page a lot. The Tokarov pistol is probably the single most underrated handgun choice for vintage collectible that I have seen in Canada. All you have to do is go into the US and ask about a Tokarov, and they will tell you you're into $700 to $800 in terms of expenditure to buy what is considered ordinarily in Canada to be a bit of a piece of junk, and there's several reasons for that. They do have a low cost connected to them relative to other firearms. The ammunition is corrosive for the most part. When you buy surplus, there are non-corrosive options available to you, but you've got this gun, that was used extensively in World War II, and if you buy yourself a wartime Tokarov, I think you're into a collectible that can only increase in value over time. And so for less than $220, I think once it's recognized as a bona fide World War II collectible in time, I think you're going to see the surplus dry up. I mean, they came to this country from Russia. I mean, there are Polish variants and Yugoslavian variants available, but if you get yourself a good Russian Tokarov, you're buying into a lot of fun, because you've got a firearm that shoots a projectile almost twice as fast as something like a .45. So it's got this fast, light, quick-moving bullet. And the trigger groups are very rough and unrefined. I mean, if you're into polishing a little bit, you can really smooth them out. Then it's not that bad at all. But to buy yourself a bona fide World War II collectible, like something from like 1944 or 1945, to buy yourself something like that for under $250, and to get a gun that is that powerful, that has the ability to hit targets, and a lot of people criticize the Tokarov and say that they're not really accurate. I would beg to disagree completely. I've been known to hit quite easily at 200 yards with Tokarovs because the bullet is so flat shooting. I mean, it's like a rifle bullet in a handgun. It's really a bit of a fire-breathing monster in some respects compared to other handguns. But so you've got this collectible for under $250 that shoots this really fast-moving, inexpensive to purchase ammunition type firearm. You've got this gun that's circulating in Canada in large numbers. The Americans go crazy. To our American listeners, we're really sorry, but Tokrovs and Russian SKSs and SVT-40s are still really inexpensive up here when compared to the U.S. And the availability of these guns is fantastic. I mean, if you want to buy a Tokrov tomorrow, just throw a rock in any given direction on an exchange, and you'll come across, a wartime Tokrov for anywhere between $175 and $225. And if you buy surplus ammo, I mean, it's certainly gone up in the last couple of years. I remember when it was, $90 for a case of 2,000 plus. I believe it's risen now to the point where you're into, $500 or $600 for a case of 1,000 now. But it's still relatively inexpensive when compared to modern production ammunition. But you've got this option to buy, this fantastic piece of World War II history for, a reasonable price, and to run it for a reasonable price. And if you spend any amount of time with it and grow accustomed to the stiff trigger, and the snappy recoil, it can be quite an accurate pistol. And I'm really looking forward to actually doing a video on our YouTube channel sometime shortly to demonstrate the accuracy potential of a firearm like that. It's one of those things that people have kind of balked at when I've told them, like, hey, Tokrovs, you might be surprised. Spend a little bit of time with one, it might grow on you. Anyway, that's about all the time we have for this week's podcast with the Canadian Gun Vault, Behind the Vault Door. We hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to contact us at the Canadian Gun Vault Inc. at gmail.com if you have any questions. And to everyone out there in the firearm community and those that are hoping to join it, you have yourself a great night.